and did.
Not while Richard was on the throne and in control of the princes.
But could have. That he was not safe with the princes in the Tower just because they had been bastardized in the manner which we have heard described.
The pre-contract and their illegitimacy remains true, whether Parliament speaks or not.
Providing it has been properly proved.
Yes.
And it's certainly, if the uprising in October, the Autumn Rebellion, was upon the basis, as it is suggested in the Chronicles, firstly upon the basis of freeing the princes, it clearly didn't seem to have very much effect on all those nobles of the south and Wales who supported that rebellion. They didn't seem to worry.
With great respect, I don't agree with the factual basis upon which Mr. Russell has made that suggestion. I'm sorry to intervene,
yes,
but I cannot accept the factual basis that it's suggested in the Chronicles that the uprising in Wales and the south and so on was to free the princes. In fact, the uprising was to put Henry VII upon the throne, and that could only have been done if the princes, of course, were dead.
Well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Dillon is not right about that. May I quote from the Croyland Chronicle? Miss Sutton, I don't know whether you are aware of this or not. What is said in the Croyland Chronicle is this: in the meantime, and while these things were going on, the two sons of King Edward, before named, remained in the Tower of London, in the custody of certain persons appointed for that purpose. In order to deliver them from this captivity, the people of the southern and western parts of the kingdom began to murmur greatly and to form meetings and confederacies. That led to the Autumn Rebellion. And what I'm suggesting to you is that if that be right, that the rebellion started upon the basis of freeing the princes, well then all those nobles of the south, and it was the whole of the south of England virtually, wasn't it?
That's a slight exaggeration.
Maybe it is. A lot of the south of England and Wales supported that rebellion to free the princes, whether or not they were bastards.
There were a lot of people involved in that rebellion who had their own personal axes to grind.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miss Sutton. Then Mr. Pollard, please. Mr. Potter, it's Ronald Jeremy Potter. I think you're the chairman of a publishing group in London and chairman of the Richard III Society and have been since 1971.
Yes.
Published a number of works, included amongst which, published by a house other than your own, is the book I hold in my hand, from which my friend has in fact already quoted, Good King Richard.
Yes.
Well, now, can I turn to Richard straight away, please? I asked Mr. Richards about his character up to the death of Edward IV. How would you put it?
Well, I would put it that at the time when Edward IV died, Richard was a man of excellent character. He'd remained unswervingly loyal to his brother, unlike Clarence and Warwick during the long wars against Lancaster. He was the leader of the vanguard at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. He was a courageous man. He'd spent 11 years as his brother's viceroy governing the north of England, where he had a reputation for just and fair administration. In fact, Mancini himself, whom we've heard was no Richard lover, said the good reputation of his private life and his public activities powerfully attracted the esteem of strangers. I mean, he was 30 at this time. His record was unblemished. He was loyal, he was brave, he was pious, he was just, and he was the last man that anyone would have expected to have killed Edward IV's sons.
He had taken them into his care, in effect, during the time in London. Would that have had an effect upon Richard and his view of them?
After Edward IV died,
yes.
He behaved impeccably, of course, and the boys came under his protection. He, as has been stated, he led an act of public fealty in York. He did the same thing when he arrived in London. He led the Lords, he led the City Fathers in acts of fealty to his nephew. And throughout May, for 5 weeks, every act, everything that was done in the country was in the name of Edward V.
The late King Edward IV expressly put the children in the protection of Richard, did he not?
The realm, certainly, and with it the children, yes.
So he had a particular responsibility and respect of them.
Yes.
And in your view, discharged that obligation upon him?
I think he behaved impeccably. The reason why he has a bad reputation is that the Tudors had to say that he was being hypocritical and deceitful. If he behaved badly, they would have said, look how badly he behaved. Since he said he behaved very well, they said, he must be a hypocrite.
So his outward display didn't mirror his actual performance?
There is no reason to suppose that his motives were impure.
He had real reason, it's quite clear from the evidence which has been given already, to fear the South, was unpractised in the court, hardly came to London in the decade or so preceding 1483, I think.
Yes, I think it should be understood that the split between North and South at the end of the 15th century was somewhat similar, in fact rather greater than it is today. And people in the North were much poorer. They were regarded by the South as dangerous savages, and the real peculiarity of Richard III is that he is the only king of England who has come from the North with northern support, his northern affinity, to claim the throne. And this naturally upset Southerners, men of Edward's household, Edward IV's household, who lost their jobs to these intruding northerners, savages from places like Yorkshire.
Well then, real reason to fear a plot against him from the Woodvilles, who don't sound a very attractive lot.
Well, the Woodvilles made a preemptive strike for power, as I think is agreed, and this naturally put Richard on his mettle. And then it became clear, in my view, that the sensible thing was that Richard should become king. I mean, a boy king would have been a disaster. Nobody wanted a boy king. It would have started the Civil War over again. And the point about Richard's assumption was that his coronation was one of the best attended in history. Everyone actually, except the rival power groups, recognized that it was the sensible and logical thing. If Richard remained as pretender, he was open in 2 or 3 years' time to the vengeance of the Woodvilles. And not only Richard himself, but everyone who had supported him, all his affinity.
How much importance then do you attach to the evidence given, if that's the right way to describe it, by Bishop Stillington about the pre-contract?
Well, I think Stillington probably was right. I mean, Stillington was a man of considerable importance. He'd been Chancellor of England for 7 years under Edward IV, which was the #1 job in the country, equivalent to Prime Minister today. And so Stillington was very far from being a nobody. Certainly, his evidence at this time was very convenient.
He was Lord Chancellor at the time?
He was Chancellor under Edward IV, not at the time. He had fallen out with Edward IV and been imprisoned at the time of Clarence's disgrace.
Yes.
And some historians assume that the reason for his disgrace was that Stillington told Clarence some years earlier of this pre-contract, which would have made Clarence the heir to the throne and not the boys, and that was the reason for Clarence's execution.
Clarence, just remind us, is the gentleman who is said to have died in a butter Malmsey, I think.
Yes, Clarence was the brother who stood between Edward IV and Richard, and if he had been alive, would have had a better claim than Richard. And perhaps I should also make this point, that he had a son alive who was called Edward, Earl of Warwick, and this was another nephew of Richard's, and his claim to the throne was better than Richard's, except that he was disbarred by Clarence's attainder. And this was a nephew of Richard's in precisely the same position as the princes. Attainders were readily reversible. Edward of Warwick, Parliament could have reversed Edward of Warwick's attainder, and that would have given him a better claim to the throne than Richard. And what happened to Edward of Warwick, we happen to know. He was well treated by Richard. He was kept up in Yorkshire in a royal nursery with Edward IV's daughters, and he was even made Richard's heir at one time.